Welcome back to Echo Mind Documentaries. If this is your first time here, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to like, comment, and share, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Today's video isn't about creatures of the wild, but about a man whose power, influence, and brutality rivaled that of the most feared predators on Earth. We're stepping into the world of crime, money, and control to uncover the rise of one of the most infamous drug lords in history, Pablo Escobar. This is not a story, this is the reality behind the empire. At his peak, Pablo Escobar was making so much money that rats were eating $40 million a year in storage. This is not a story about wealth. This is a story about what power without conscience looks like. He fed the poor, built houses, and funded football fields. He was also responsible for the deaths of thousands of judges, politicians, and civilians. The world has never seen a criminal quite like Pablo Escobar. And he did it all from a small town in Colombia that no one had ever heard of. In the mountains of Colombia, in a region called Antioquia, a boy was born in 1949 to a school teacher and a farmer. They were poor, humble, unremarkable by every standard the world uses to measure a life. His name was Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, and within 3 decades, that name would become the most feared in the Western Hemisphere. To understand Pablo Escobar, you have to understand the world that produced him. Colombia in the mid-20th century was a country fractured by violence, inequality, and political warfare. The decade known as La Violencia had torn the nation apart between 1948 and 1958, leaving over 200,000 Colombians dead in a conflict that was part civil war, part class struggle, and part political vendetta. The institutions that were supposed to protect ordinary people had either collapsed or been captured by the powerful. In rural Antioquia, the poor were left entirely to fend for themselves. Government was something that happened to other people, people with money and connections. For families like the Escobars, it was simply absent. Pablo grew up watching that absence. He watched his mother work tirelessly for almost nothing. He watched his father labor in the fields, and somewhere in that watching, something hardened in him, a refusal, a decision that poverty was not his destiny and that he would use whatever tools were available to escape it. In a country where the law protected the wealthy and ignored the rest, Pablo Escobar decided very early that the law was not something he was obligated to respect. He started small, stealing tombstones from cemeteries, sanding off the inscriptions, and reselling them to grieving families. It was a hustle that told you everything about how his mind worked: ruthless, opportunistic, and completely unbothered by the moral weight of what he was doing. He moved on to petty theft, street scams, and eventually low-level contraband. By his late teens, he was already known in the back alleys of Medellín as someone you could count on to move things that couldn't move through official channels. Medellín itself was a city in transformation. Once a quiet industrial town, it had swelled into a sprawling metropolis where migration from the countryside had created vast, neglected hillside neighborhoods called comunas. These were communities of people who had been left behind by every system that was supposed to serve them. And into that vacuum, men like Pablo Escobar stepped. By his early 20s, Escobar had graduated from petty crime to something far more serious. He was involved in car theft, kidnapping for ransom, and the smuggling of small quantities of contraband. He was building a reputation not just as someone willing to do dirty work, but as someone intelligent enough to organize it. He was calculating, he studied people, he understood leverage, and he was utterly without sentimentality when it came to getting what he wanted. The turn came in the mid-1970s. Cocaine was beginning its explosion into the American market, and someone needed to build the infrastructure to supply it. The raw material coca grew in abundance in the Colombian and Peruvian countryside. The market in the United States was enormous and almost entirely unserved at scale. What was missing was organization, distribution, the ruthless efficiency of a real criminal enterprise. Pablo Escobar provided all of it. He began by taxing small cocaine producers in exchange for protection and distribution. Then he started building his own supply chain from the ground up. He secured processing labs in the jungle. He established smuggling routes through Panama, the Caribbean, and across the southern border of the United States. He bribed customs officials, border agents, airline employees, and politicians. He recruited chemists, pilots, accountants, and enforcers. What Escobar built was not just a drug operation. It was a vertically integrated multinational corporation, one that happened to deal in an illegal substance that was making him extraordinarily wealthy. He partnered with other powerful traffickers, the Ochoa family, Carlos Letter, Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, and together they formed what became known as the Medellín Cartel. It was not a formal organization with a charter or bylaws. It was a coalition of powerful men with aligned interests held together by mutual profit and the threat of mutual destruction. And at the center of it, increasingly, was Pablo Escobar, the most ambitious, the most willing to use violence, the one who set the tone for how the cartel operated. And the cartel operated without mercy. At the height of its power in the 1980s, the Medellín Cartel was responsible for supplying approximately 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. 80%. The numbers that surrounded Escobar during this period strained credulity. He was earning an estimated $60 million per day. His total net worth reached an estimated $15 billion. Forbes magazine placed him on their list of the world's wealthiest individuals multiple times during the decade. His operation employed over 3,000 people directly and tens of thousands more indirectly. The scale of the money was so obscene that his accountants estimated they wrote off 10% of their annual cash supply simply because rats had eaten through the bills in storage. He bought fleets of aircraft and fleets of cars. He built a private zoo on his estate, Hacienda Nápoles, stocking it with hippos, giraffes, and exotic birds. He constructed a mansion with a private airstrip. He funded his own political career, winning election to the Colombian Congress as an alternate representative in 1982, briefly achieving the immunity from prosecution that came with political office. He was photographed with presidential candidates. He moved through the upper circles of Colombian society with the confidence of a man who believed he had purchased his respectability, along with everything else. But the other face of Pablo Escobar was one that no amount of money could make presentable. The phrase he lived by was Plata or Plomo, silver or lead. It was not a metaphor, it was an operational policy. Every judge, every politician, every police officer who stood in his way was offered a choice: accept a bribe or accept a bullet. The sums he offered were staggering enough to transform a public servant's entire family for generations. Many took the money. Those who did not were killed. Escobar was not bluffing. He never bluffed. His willingness to follow through on every threat was the foundation of his power, and he knew it. Judges who agreed to hear cases against cartel members were assassinated. Journalists who investigated his operations were murdered. Police officers were gunned down in the streets. It was systematic, organized, clinical. Pablo Escobar was not committing crimes of passion. He was managing a business, and violence was one of his most reliable tools. And yet, and this is the paradox that has made Escobar one of the most written about criminals in history, he was also genuinely beloved by the poor of Medellín. He built entire neighborhoods of low-income housing in the comunas and gave the homes away for free. He constructed churches and schools. He funded community football leagues and built sports facilities for children who had no other outlet. He handed out cash in the streets, sometimes literally passing money through car windows to families who approached him. He paid for funerals for the destitute. He funded local celebrations and festivals. In the barrios of Medellín, the places where the government's promises had always been empty, Pablo Escobar delivered. He was one of them. He had come from poverty. He had refused to stay there, and he had not forgotten where he came from. To the poor of Antioquia, he was El Patron, the boss, the benefactor, the man who did what no politician had ever done, who actually showed up. The fact that his money came from cocaine and murder was not lost on people. It simply mattered less in the calculus of daily survival than the fact that he was building the roof over their head.
This duality, the murderer and the patron saint, is what made him so difficult for the Colombian state to confront. Because when the government moved against Escobar, it was not just fighting a criminal. In the eyes of many poor Colombians, it was fighting one of their own. The confrontation became inevitable when the Colombian government, under intense pressure from the United States, began negotiating an extradition treaty that would allow Colombian nationals to be tried in American courts. For Escobar and the other cartel leaders, extradition was the one thing they truly feared. They owned Colombia. They had bought its judges, its politicians, its military officers, but they had no reach into the American justice system. A trial in the United States meant a real prison sentence. It meant the end of everything. Escobar responded the only way he knew how. He declared war. What followed was a campaign of terror that stunned even those who thought they understood the depths of the cartel's brutality. Escobar's forces, which he called Los Extraditables, bombed the offices of newspapers that had supported extradition. They assassinated the Minister of Justice, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, in 1984, shot dead on a Bogotá street in blazing daylight. They murdered the director of the National Police. They assassinated 3 presidential candidates running in the 1989 election. Most devastatingly, Luis Carlos Galán, who had been the frontrunner and a fierce anti-corruption crusader, shot dead at a campaign rally in front of thousands of supporters. In November 1989, Escobar's men placed a bomb on Avianca Flight 203, a domestic Colombian airliner. The bomb detonated mid-flight. All 107 people on board were killed. The target had been presidential candidate Cesar Gaviria, who was not on the plane. 107 people died for nothing. The following month, a truck bomb detonated outside the headquarters of the DAS, Colombia's intelligence agency in Bogotá. The explosion killed 70 people and wounded hundreds more, shattering windows for blocks in every direction. It remains one of the largest terrorist attacks ever carried out on Colombian soil. Escobar also placed a standing bounty on the heads of Colombian police officers, paying his men 3 million pesos for every officer they killed. In Medellín, young men from the comunas became sicarios, hired assassins, picking off police as a way to earn money. The city became a war zone. The murder rate in Medellín in 1991 reached 381 homicides per 100,000 residents, making it the most violent city on earth. Walking to work was an act of courage. Driving through certain neighborhoods was suicide. The Colombian government, reeling and outmaneuvered, eventually suspended extradition and opened negotiations. The result was one of the most astonishing episodes in the history of organized crime. Pablo Escobar agreed to surrender to Colombian authorities on his own terms. Those terms were extraordinary. He would serve his sentence not in a standard Colombian prison, but in a facility called La Catedral, built on a hillside above Medellín to specifications that Escobar himself had approved. What resulted was less a prison than a private compound. La Catedral had a football pitch, a bar stocked with his preferred liquors, a jacuzzi, luxury furnishings, a waterfall, and a discotheque. The guards at the perimeter answered to Escobar. His associates visited freely. He continued to hold business meetings and make operational decisions. He was, in every meaningful sense, not imprisoned at all. He had negotiated himself a luxury retreat with the legal protection of a prison sentence. He remained there for over a year. But in July 1992, the Colombian government, embarrassed by international scrutiny and evidence that Escobar had continued running his operations from inside La Catedral, attempted to transfer him to a real military facility. They arrived to find the compound in a state of barely concealed contempt, and Pablo Escobar was gone. He had simply walked out through the perimeter he controlled and disappeared into the mountains. What followed was 17 months of the most intense manhunt in Colombian history. The Colombian National Police, led by General Miguel Maza Marquez and later by Colonel Hugo Martinez, deployed thousands of officers. The United States sent DEA agents and intelligence assets. American surveillance aircraft flew missions over Medellín. A secret unit called the Search Block was formed with one singular mission: find Escobar.
Shadowing the official effort was an unofficial one, a vigilante group calling itself Los Pepes, which stood for People Persecuted by Pablo Escobar, began systematically targeting the cartel's infrastructure. They burned Escobar's properties, killed his associates, and hunted his family. Los Pepes was funded in part by rival traffickers from the Cali cartel, who recognized that Escobar's war on the state was bad for business, and in part by individuals with personal grievances against Escobar. Their methods were brutal and extra-legal, but they were effective. Every asset Escobar relied upon was being systematically dismantled. Escobar moved constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice, communicating by short radio bursts that he believed were untraceable. He stayed in working-class neighborhoods of Medellín, hiding in plain sight among the poor who had always protected him. He wrote letters to the Colombian press, still defiant, still projecting an image of control. He called his family regularly, a habit that would ultimately cost him everything. By late 1993, the net was tightening. Colombian intelligence had developed radio triangulation technology capable of locating a signal source within minutes of transmission. Escobar's calls to his son and wife were the vulnerability that his enemies had been waiting for. On December 2, 1993, the day after his 44th birthday, a transmission was traced to a quiet, middle-class neighborhood in the Los Olivos district of Medellín. The search blocks surrounded the block. Officers moved in. There was a chase across the rooftop of the house where Escobar had been hiding. Shots were fired, and Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was killed, shot once behind the ear, likely by his own hand according to some accounts, by police fire according to others. The most powerful criminal in the world died on a rooftop in the city where he had grown up, alone, in hiding, hunted to the end. The photographs of his body were broadcast around the world. Colombian police officers posed with the corpse. There was celebration in the streets. The American embassy released a statement. The Colombian president addressed the nation. And then, slowly, the reckoning began. What had the war against Escobar actually cost? The official death toll from the cartel's campaign of terror ran into the thousands. Judges, politicians, journalists, police officers, civilians. Thousands more had died in the violence that Escobar's presence had injected into Colombian society. The sicarios, the bystanders, the poor young men from Medellín who had become killers because there was no other economy available to them. An entire generation of Colombians had grown up under a blanket of fear so thick that it had become the background texture of ordinary life. And the cocaine trade he had built, it did not die with him. The Medellín Cartel fractured into smaller organizations. The Cali Cartel, which had operated more quietly throughout the Escobar era, expanded its reach. New trafficking networks emerged, more decentralized, more sophisticated, harder to target. The fundamental economics that had made Escobar possible, the enormous demand for cocaine in the United States and Europe, the poverty that made recruitment easy in Colombia and across Latin America, those economics had not changed. The supply chain reorganized, the money kept moving. Escobar had believed himself irreplaceable. He was not. He was a chapter, not the whole story. What remained, and what has only grown with time, was the legend. The murals in the comunas of Medellín, where some still paint his face as a patron and a martyr.
the narco-tourism industry that has built itself around his former estates, his hideouts, the rooftop where he died, the television series, the films, the podcasts, the books, a cultural industry that has metabolized his story into entertainment and distributed it to hundreds of millions of people around the world who never lived through any of it. The myth of Escobar has a seductive logic: the poor boy who refused his poverty, the man who outmaneuvered governments, the Robin Hood who built houses for the destitute. It is a compelling story. It is also a profoundly incomplete one. The families of the judges he killed do not find it compelling. The passengers of Avianca Flight 203, or what remained of them, could not speak to it at all. The children who grew up in Medellín during the years of peak cartel violence, who learned to recognize the sound of a car bomb before they learned to read, carry a version of that story that no television series has ever fully told.
Pablo Escobar was not a hero who made some bad choices. He was a man who chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to build his empire on the bodies of other people. He understood what he was doing. He was intelligent enough and informed enough to know the cost of every decision he made. He made those decisions anyway, not because he had no choice, but because he placed his own ambition, his own survival, and his own comfort above every other consideration, every time. That is not strength. That is the absence of it. True strength, the kind that actually builds something lasting, requires a foundation. It requires the capacity to consider the cost of your actions to others. It requires conscience. And Pablo Escobar, for all his intelligence and organizational genius and personal charisma, was a man who operated without one. He built an empire on a foundation of fear, and fear is the most unstable foundation in the world. It holds as long as the threat holds. The moment the threat weakens, everything built on top of it begins to collapse. His empire lasted roughly 15 years at its height. His death was lonely and undignified. His family fled Colombia and lived for decades in hiding, changing their names, moving from country to country, trying to escape the shadow of what he had built. His son has spent much of his adult life traveling the world to apologize to the families of his father's victims. His legacy, in practical terms, is rubble. And yet, the legend persists because human beings are drawn to the story of the man who refused the rules, the man who looked at the system that was supposed to govern him and said simply, no. There is something in that refusal that resonates, particularly for people who have been failed by that system, particularly for the poor, the overlooked, the ones the world has decided do not matter. But there is a difference between refusing an unjust system and replacing it with terror. There is a difference between ambition and destruction. Pablo Escobar confused those two things his entire life. He believed that power was the point, that the accumulation of money and fear and influence was the goal. He never understood, or never allowed himself to understand, that power exercised without moral grounding does not build anything. It only consumes. He rose higher than almost anyone in history. He fell just as hard, and he took thousands of people with him on the way down. That is the true legacy of Pablo Escobar. Not the billions, not the mythology, not the murals on the wall. The legacy is the wreckage, the families that never recovered, the country that spent a decade bleeding, the young men who became killers because he made that the most available career in their neighborhood, the children who never knew their fathers because their fathers took the honest job, the police officer, the judge, the journalist, and paid for it with their lives. Remember the whole story, not just the parts that make it easy to admire him, because the rise was real, and so was the fall. And the fall was not an accident. It was the only place the road he chose could ever lead.